The Ryan Tubridy Show on RTE Radio 1 with Vodafone Simply Broadband. All the fibre broadband you want, none of the landline costs you don't.
Before me sits cosmetic Dr. Patrick Treacy. And Patrick, if you don't know him, is medical director of the Aylesbury Clinic, has branches in Dublin and Cork, London and the Middle East as far flung. And he's led an intriguing life, which he reveals in his new autobiography, Behind the Mask. And in the book he discusses celebrity clients and friends like the late Michael Jackson, who we heard from earlier on, and from in a musical sense. But there's a lot more to Patrick's story, I think, than just befriending the Prince of Pop. And that's why we're glad to welcome you to the programme this morning. Thanks for coming in to see us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Ryan.
From Anaman originally.
Exactly.
A happy childhood, would you say, or troubled childhood?
A very happy childhood. Grew up on the borders between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
Yes.
On the banks of Loch Melvin. A really interesting place. It was where Charlie Chaplin used to come and fish during the period he fell out, I suppose, with
Hollywood.
America and Hollywood over the whole communist era. And it was unique as well because Beleak Pottery was just 3 or 4 miles down the road, and that was one of Northern Ireland's biggest tourist things. So we had youth hostels in the village when I grew up. So I'd be used to, when I was 13 or 14, sitting strumming, playing Bob Dylan songs with Americans and Germans. So it was a very idyllic childhood. And of course, then the Northern Ireland Troubles kicked off.
Yeah, did you get much first-hand experience of the Troubles then?
Oh my God. I think we were really in the middle of the war zone. Fermanagh, South Armagh and Belfast is really where it kicked off. So I had this situation, I suppose, in the early 70s where a lot of my neighbours that would be coming into my father's garage would be killed. They would have been initially members of the B Specials, then the UDR. And I must say the Catholics in that period did feel a grievance, there's no doubt about it, and felt almost, I suppose, left on their own to deal with things. The south of Ireland sort of turned away from them. And there was no doubt about it that during that whole period that it was a different time.
Yeah.
American civil rights were kicking off, and Catholics in Northern Ireland felt that they were underdogs as well, which of course they were. I mean, in Fermanagh alone, we had 27 bus drivers and 3 of them were Catholic. And we had, I suppose, a situation of our town councillors were only sort of, 10 or 15% were Catholic in a county that had a Catholic majority.
Yes.
And when it was an awful situation from the point of view that when things started to really go off initially, we'd have a situation where my father would be fixing punctures in the garage, and we'd have IRA volunteers in standing beside B Specials UDR men. And when the sort of sun went down in the evening, they put away their mowing machines and they took out their guns and started firing at each other. And, that would have been in everyday life.
Even the way you're talking about it was so common to us growing up, but it feels like a different country now given what's been happening in on the island.
Absolutely. And we'd have a situation also where we were just across the border from Ballyshannon and Bundoran, and when we'd go into the pubs drinking at night time, you'd have IRA volunteers coming in from missions on the run, and they would have shot somebody that day and you would have known it. I
remember going up to South Armagh doing a report as a younger man, and the racket out of the helicopters,
oh my God,
constant.
Absolutely.
Kind of window shaking.
Yes,
noise.
we all live in a prison where certainly, we were being spied upon by the British Army every day, and there's no doubt about it. I have many memories and YouTube videos actually, of my mother just standing there in helicopter just over her head all day long. It never ended.
You got into, you went to Queen's.
I went to Queen's.
And you studied there and you got involved in student politics.
Well, I suppose initially I had won the British Amateur Young Scientist of the Year, and I won the Aer Lingus with biochemists when I was still, sort of quite young, and I wasn't sure what direction to go in. And I became president of the Hall's residence, and in that period also a lot of Catholic students were being targeted. 2 or 3 were taken out and killed, and we had a situation, I suppose, one day where one of our halls, called Allenbrook Hall, had the tricolour hung over it. Now you've got to remember all the other halls that Union Jacks hanging on them, and it was treasonous at that stage just to have a Union or another flag flying on that territory. And some of our committee members got sent bullets, and I myself got assaulted. I got my legs broken, and we had a situation, I suppose, where it was almost dangerous for me to stay in Northern Ireland. And as a consequence, my mother, who I suppose had grown up in the south of Ireland, and a lot of her family were Fianna Fáil senators. She thought it was probably
time
more
to get
astute
out.
for me to, because I wanted to pursue medicine at that stage.
Yes.
I went to New York, spent a wonderful summer in New York with some friends, and during that period met Janet Onassis, was chatting for about 20 minutes, met John Lennon.
How did you meet?
Well, believe it or not, I was working in a place called the Manhattan Plaza, and all we were doing was cleaning it before the guests all come in. So there's equity actors that stayed there.
Yeah.
Woody Allen was there. I met Woody every morning for almost
really?
2 months, for breakfast, And up the street was the Lion Theatre, and Jackie was holding a protest to keep it open with only about 20 people. And I wanted to go up to it. My boss, who was from Kerry, says, if you go up, you lose your job,
Yeah.
So I went up anyway, and I started chatting to her about Ireland. We went to an hotel, actually, and I sat chatting for a long time about Ireland. And I come back, the boss from Kerry says, "What a story like that, we'll have to hold on to you."
And and John Lennon?
John Lennon had been in Japan, and I had a girlfriend at the time in New York who ripped up my ticket home. It was 180 quid, and you just couldn't get another one. And
she wanted you to stay so much.
She wanted me to stay, yes.
Such was the irresistibility.
And I was in that period about whether to go back to medicine or not.
Okay.
So I was staying on anyway. So college was going to start for me in the September. This is October, November,
yes.
And I met him in Central Park. And he was a nice guy. I had a talk, and for somebody that provided one of the soundtracks of my life,
for sure,
for sure.
And so it's so poignant, the monument to him.
He only died 2 or 3 years after that.
That's right, and the little Strawberry Fields thing in Central Park.
That was a wonderful year as well. It was the year that the Son of Sam stalked the streets of New York.
Yeah.
Elvis Presley had died. Elton John and Kiki Dee played in Central Park. I remember it almost like yesterday.
Yeah, fun and interesting times, to say the least. But so you had to come back to college.
I came back to college, and I was going to do medicine in Queen's, but it was very apprehensive about it. And then an incident happened in Northern Ireland, just outside our house, where the local bread man was working for the UDR, and he was gunned down by the IRA. And I was one of the people that sort of, I wouldn't say witnessed the event, but I was there, sort of a couple of minutes after it. And then my mother sort of said,
It's time. You went to the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin.
Yes.
Not a cheap place to study. So you had to raise the funds, and you came up with some, shall we say, curious fundraising methods.
Believe it or not, when I went originally, I had my grant in place.
Yes.
But because I spent some years in Queen's, Margaret Thatcher came into power in 79. Dennis Callan, if you remember, all the sort of rubbish was in the streets. It was the winter of protest, the winter of discontent. And when Margaret Thatcher came in, she brought in Keynesian economics, and as a consequence, she decided that I could only get 6 years for medicine, and I'd used up the first 3, sort of in Queen's University Belfast. But the problem was, she told me in 1981, when I'd already won a lot of gold medals from college, and I was facing 25,000 a year.
Yeah.
So myself and some friends went to Germany to try and collect the funds originally. We formed a painting company. We were what they called Fensterstreichen, and it was obvious we weren't going to get enough funds. So my other friends went back to college, and I noticed a sort of a scam that sort of the German students were doing, and that was bringing cars down to Turkey, and they could buy a car for 1,000 at the time, Deutschmarks, and sell them for 4,000.
So flip them, essentially. Yeah.
And growing up in a border area where we had a situation in my garage where all the customers from Leitrim and Donegal would come up with butter to our house, and my father put on tyres for them and take off made in the UK, and that sort of swap went all along the border. It wasn't a big extension.
Followed Patrick. I was intrigued in your book about your first job as a practicing surgeon and your collision, for want of a better word, with a needle that was potentially...
Yeah, this is bad. This was 1987, and HIV stalked the land almost like Ebola on steroids. Everybody thought that if you kissed somebody, you would die from it. There was no cure at all. And a 17-year-old came into Blanchardstown Hospital one night, and when I was treating him, I had 10 mils of blood sitting on a syringe. We didn't have the HIV syringe at the time. I needed to do a femoral stab because he was very cyanotic. He probably would have died without tubing him. He was a very severe asthmatic. And he thought I was going to get another vein, so he turned around and says, "There's one here, Doc," that he used himself. And he sort of fell over. The needle stuck on my leg, and he immediately turned around and says, "By the way, I'm HIV positive." So I left it down immediately. I went up to theatre. I got a friend of mine who's an orthopaedic surgeon now to cut a lump out of my leg. I didn't tell him why. I said, consider this like a malignant melanoma. The nurse in charge of theatre came out and she says, when she heard what had happened, she says, my doctor hasn't double gloved. She shut down theatre. She asked me to leave the hospital, and they moved a hip joint they were doing into another theatre. That was the fear that stalked the land.
Yes.
In that day also, a gastroscope had been burnt because they discovered the patient was HIV, and it was a brand new one that cost 23,000. So I sort of went back down. I came to the Royal College of Surgeons. I don't want to mention the doctors involved because their sons and family are still alive. But she told me there's 41 needle sticks in the world. 4 have died, including a girl recently last week in London. And of those ones that have died, they're all IVIM. Thankfully, you're not. I said, well, Professor, of course I am. I'm IVIM. And she says, oh my God, nobody told me that. You're going to die then, most probably, if you look at this factually. So I was in a situation where I knew for the next 3 or 4 years I was going to have to get checked 4 times a year. And this was in the days before antiretroviral drugs.
And did you had to get checked for all the time, and
yes,
for that amount of time? It's quite terrifying in some respects.
Yes.
You ended up in Baghdad because your life, you're like Zelig almost, because these encounters with people and places and times. But there you are in Baghdad in 1990, where they were on the cusp of this invasion of Kuwait, of course, and you were a locum in a hospital there.
And just before that, I was in the Berlin Wall before it sort of fell, and then went straight into Ibn al-Battar in Baghdad. So if you remember, the Irish ran a tertiary referral centre.
Yes.
And Saddam Hussein ruled the country at the time. But in that period, one of my jobs was getting up at night time to go down to ICU to take blood cultures off 3 or 4 times a night, which was a sort of a job that was quite frustrating from the point of view that I suppose nobody wanted the big culture bottles in and all the rest. But we noticed that a lot of the patients were coming from Soleimani and from Kurdistan, and they were all the Iraqi patients. But the Sunday Times of the period, March the 18th, had turned round and said that he had gassed the Kurds, and America originally blamed Iran, as you know. So I suppose being an adventurer, I went up into the area, and this was some months after the event, so there was nothing really there. But I'd cross into the city with the Peshmerga, which were the freedom fighters.
Yes.
And on the way, I suppose, back out. And don't forget, I was reporting for the papers at that time as well, and I had done, a big report on Berlin, and, this was my golden opportunity.
Yes.
Stuck in the middle of one of the biggest human catastrophes since the Second World War. And so I was caught, and I was put in jail.
And how was your jail experience?
Well, the taxi driver that was with me probably never seen the light of day. At night time, I'd be there listening to people obviously being tortured, and the judge gave me a year's jail sentence, but they never seemed to move me from the police station to the jail. And
were you terrified or stoical?
Oh, I was, I suppose, a mixture of both. And one of my biggest problems was the fact that nobody knew I was there, because I'd sort of gone up on my own, and I was also carrying a license of an Nesamatrol Jeep that Bazarov had originally had, because my nursing staff health, and he had been beheaded just in the weeks before that, actually. And while I was there, one morning, a colonel came down, he put a gun beside me on the bed. He said, you think we're all barbarians? And I said, no, I don't think so. And he said, I know James Joyce, I know Trinity College.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Amazing.
And he roughed me up a little bit, brought me up in front of his colleagues, and effectively threw me outside a door, and then threw my knapsack out after me. And I turned around and said, well, what about Mohammed? And he just sternly, he never said anything, he just looked cold. And I made my way back to Baghdad, which was 760 miles from where I was, by taxi. Phoned up the hospital, got one of my friends to give me my gear, flew to Copenhagen that night. That was the first sort of taxi, or the first flight out to Europe. And that was August the 1st. And August the 2nd, I was in the Galway races, and it was shown on the television that Saddam had invaded Kuwait. So by sheer twist of fate, Ryan, if you can imagine, all my friends that I thought were free 1 week before were all now the hostages that held in the hospital, 450.
Amazing.
And I was the only one that was free.
And now we bounce to the bizarre, nature of your life, I suppose. Now we head to Michael Jackson. How did you meet Michael Jackson? What were the circumstances of that first encounter?
Well, I suppose there are dots along the line.
Yes.
And one of the dots along the line was when I was free of knowing that I wasn't, I suppose, going to ever be HIV. I went to Africa and I worked with some of the people there. And
is it difficult for you to talk about this now?
Sure.
And what is going on in your mind that makes that difficult?
Well, the book was cathartic in a way for me.
Yeah, I get that impression.
Yeah, AIDS was sort of kicking off in Africa, but a lot of, I suppose, whites seen it as black man's disease because it followed the route from Zambia down to Johannesburg, where the copper mines and the trucks were. And in that period, I wrote about it, predicted that it was going to spiral, and won some awards for sort of my journalism of the period. When I was doing that, one of the articles I'd written was called The Silence of the Savannah.
Yes.
And actually, believe it or not, Ryan, I was on your show in 2006.
I know. On Tubridy Tonight.
Yes.
Yes.
And when I went back to the office, there was a black lady sitting in the office saying, I'd like you to look after one of my clients. He'd like to meet you and be his doctor.
She'd seen you on the TV. Is that it? Or she'd heard about you from the TV?
There was an article, I believe, in the Sunday Independent just before it.
So she saw you. She came to you and said, I want you to meet a client of mine.
Yes.
And off you went to meet
Well, not really. He was going to arrive at 10:30 that night.
Okay, he was coming to you, yeah.
And we didn't know who it was. Now, we would see a lot of, I suppose, famous clients in Aylesbury. Only actually last week we had a singer in from, I suppose, Los Angeles that sold 250 million records last year. I just seen on one of his things before I came in, and he's a British singer.
Yeah,
but
and he was in for some.
He was in for hair transplant.
Hair transplant.
Okay. So we wouldn't be unused to sort of meeting people, but so when he was outside originally, we could see him in the video, and my nurse was saying, "It's Puff Daddy," we think, this type of thing. So when he came in originally, he says to me, "Hi, I'm Michael Jackson," as if I needed to know who he was. Obviously, one of the most recognisable faces on the planet. And his first words to me were, "Thank you for what you've done for the people of Africa." And he took out one of the articles I've written at Silence of the Savannah, and he read it out to me. And he says, "I cried when I read that." And I suppose from that, I treated him for many things, including his vitiligo. He was black and white. A lot of people don't realise.
Yeah, to explain that. We saw him as in the Jackson 5 as a distinctly black man.
Surely.
So did he use surgery to whiten himself up, or do you think he actually had a skin disorder?
Oh no, I know. I mean, I treated him for many years.
Expert,
absolutely.
And he had a skin disorder.
His skin was black and white, and he depigmented his hands, his feet, and his face.
He which?
Depigmented.
He did that himself?
No, we did.
You did that?
Yeah.
Which mean, in layman's terms, depigmentation means is that a whitening thing?
Yes, it's sort of like a bleaching agent, but it's more, we were using something to switch off his melanocytes. So that left him susceptible to basal cell skin cancers, which is the reason he wore the mask in the sun all the time. He also suffered from lupus. So as a consequence, he couldn't face the sun either. Oh. So, he should have been more honest with the world. And number one, put his hand up and said, "Look, I have vitiligo." And number two, as a consequence of this, I can't go out in the sun. So every time he wore an umbrella, when he looked a bit, sort of feminine, I mean, he was doing it to shield himself from the sun.
Did you ever ask him or get into his mind in terms of why he wanted to be white or to whiten himself?
But he wanted to be white because, I mean, there was either a choice of making his white parts black or his black parts white. I mean, many people with vitiligo do this. He wouldn't be unusual that way. I mean, the condition is horrendous from the point of view that when he walked in my surgery first, he took down de Vivier's dermatology book. It's about 370 pages long. And he came to a page where there was a black child with vitiligo. And he turned around and says, "Nobody knows the pain that child is going through." And then he pulled up his trouser leg and he showed me that he was totally black and white. And I mean, just like a piebald pony, really. And then sort of from his neck down, he still was like that. So we depigmented him.
What struck you about him, Michael Jackson, as a person?
A couple of things. I suppose his practical joking, his sort of comedic sort of acts, his intelligence to an extent as well, his perfection in all he wanted to do. And also, there was an incredible loneliness about him, and he felt that America had rejected him, particularly on the night of the WMA Awards. I mean, he wanted to look well for the Queen because at that time also Casino Royale was on, and he bottled out of that. And despite what the papers had said, that he was booed off the stage of the WMA Awards, the fact fans actually turned around and really loved him at that. But he came back and he was very, very dejected, and he felt that he wasn't going to make a comeback during that period.
Was he physically a frail-looking person?
To an extent, he sort of used diet pills from time to time, but a lot of dancers do that. I mean, I worked on cruise liners, so I'd be well used to that type of thing. But his heart was strong, and certainly most of his blood tests and everything would have been showing somebody with normal health.
And you saw the scar from the Pepsi ad burn, didn't you? I mean, did he wear a wig? Was that what it was, his hair, or was his hair real?
He did indeed. One day he brought into me a Sunday Times article on the Murray twins that had been burnt in that sort of gangland affair down in Limerick.
In Limerick, yes.
And he turned around and said to me, Patrick, are those children in pain? And he wanted to go into Crumlin Hospital where I'd worked. And he says, can you bring me in? But I thought it was too soon after the Santa Maria trial. And he turned around to me.
What happened in that trial?
Well, there was 14, I suppose...
minors?
No. Cases that, for paedophilia, they were all sort of thrown out by the court as falsehoods.
Okay, yes, that because there was that sort of suspicion.
That was just straight after it, and then he had gone to Bahrain, and then he came to Ireland and was living in Ireland in that period.
And was Ireland a bolt hole for him? Was he escaping from all that unwanted attention?
I think that's fair to say, yeah.
How long was he living here?
He lived here for 7 or 8 months.
And you attended his funeral?
Yes.
So you obviously got close enough to him that you became...
I was down in Michael in the house on many occasions. I put his children to bed with him.
Is that right?
Yes. And, the first time that I sort of brought one of the children to bed was Blanket, but I thought it was Paris because his hair was so long. And he had put Prince to bed downstairs, and the children would turn around saying, I love you, Daddy, and all the rest. Yeah. And at this time, I didn't know really, whether he was a paedophile or not. But I mean, as I grew to see him with his children and grew, I suppose, to love him in that way, I knew that he couldn't have been. And I'm walking up the stairs with sort of blanket in my hands, and I said, she's a lovely child, isn't she? And he says, that's my second son, Patrick. But what a wonderful person from the point of view that his humanity was certainly there. I wasn't aware that he had gone into hospitals all the time, so I advised him against going into Crumlin. But he did, at the time, take off his wig, showed me where he was burnt. I hadn't known that either. And cried and said, I know the pain that those children are under.
Your business, the Aylesbury Clinic, is well known. How's business? Is it flying? And has it increased since the recession has tapered off for some?
We all took a hit during the recession, there's no doubt about it, and we were in expansion phase at that stage, and I suppose got caught like everybody else. Yes, business is back again, almost at the levels that it was in 2007. But I suppose some of our expansorial plans in the Middle East, we're just catching up in them again. So we've heard clinics now in Saudi Arabia and in India. We've a franchise with 42 clinics there, with the Richfield Group, and in Saudi Arabia. And but believe it or not, I always thought the aesthetic side of it, rather than the hair transplant, would have been the one that would grow. But
it's all about the hair. Patrick Treacy, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. It's an extraordinary life you've led so far. The book is called Behind the Mask: The Extraordinary Story of the Irishman Who Became Michael Jackson's Doctor. It's published by Liberties Press, and it's been great to talk to you about that. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Ryan.